is Raymond Gilpin. I head USIP's work on sustainable economies. Thank you very much for joining us for today's discussion titled Natural Resources, Plunder, or Peace. I'm sure we're all familiar with varying discussions of the resource curse, the paradox of plenty, Dutch disease, and many other investigations into the use and abuse of natural resources in various countries across the world. Competition for control of natural resources has contributed to the outbreak of conflict in many cases. In other cases, revenue from natural resources have fueled and sustained violent conflict. And power derived from control of natural resources in many cases has also made it difficult for peace and mediation efforts to be successful. We could turn to countries like Cambodia, where timber and gems were an issue, Angola, where it was oil and diamonds, Aceh, where it was natural gas, or the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where we had and still have a broad array of natural resources that make both conflict pervasive and peace more elusive for most people. In most cases, revenue from these resources has been plundered to benefit a few, while millions are impoverished and disenfranchised. This dynamic undermines prospects for stability and sustainable economic development. Estimates of revenue losses from the abuse of natural resources on an annual basis runs into billions of US dollar equivalent. And the question being asked over and over again is, how can these resources be redirected in a manner that doesn't end up in plunder, but ends up in promoting both sustainable economic development and peace for all? This morning, we're particularly honored and glad to have both Paul Collier and Nancy Birdsall to help us think through some of the more difficult aspects of this dynamic. Their bios are available outside, so I wouldn't go into much detail, but suffice to say that Paul Collier needs very little introduction. He's made significant contributions to our thinking about the relationship between economic issues and conflict, which started during his and became most prominent during his tenure at the World Bank. Whether you're thinking about his work on greed versus grievance or his publications, including The Bottom Billion, one thing is clear. Whether you agree with Paul Collier or disagree with him, one thing is undeniable, that he forces you to rethink assumptions, and he has contributed greatly to a lot of the productive research into this dynamic in recent years. Nancy Birdsall is president of the Center for Global Development. Under her leadership, the center has become one of the foremost think tanks in areas including international development, economic development, and the role of natural resources in the development process. We are particularly pleased to have her here and look forward to her contribution. We're going to have a couple of presentations from Paul and Nancy in that order, and following their presentations, we'll have comments, and the first question's going to Judy Asuni and Patricia Velasquez, who are Jennings Randolph Fellows here at USIP. And after that, we would open the floor for a moderated Q&A session. We would place cue cards on your chairs, and we would ask you to write your questions, and before the Q&A starts, we have able people around who will go around and collect them, and we'll find time to pose as many questions to both Paul and Nancy as we could. But before I ask Paul to come and give his presentation, which is based on his new book, The Plundered Planet, I'll ask if you kindly do what I call the silencing of the cell phone ceremony. And it's basically if it buzzes, vibrates, rings, sings, or chimes, Please silence it for the duration of this program, and I'm sure that we'll be able to have a BlackBerry break at the end of this session so we could all catch up with the important things that we have missed. And so without much ado, join me in welcoming our first speaker, Professor Paul Collier.
Well, thanks very much, Raymond, and thanks to USIP for inviting me back. I must say, looking around, an awful lot of people in this audience I know or knew, so it's nice to be here. The broad subject is the subject of natural assets and indeed natural liabilities, and I'm going to immediately cut down to one group of natural assets, which is subsoil assets, natural resources, the stuff that's taken out from under the ground. And I'm going to start with a very simple, but I think quite dramatic figure. I think it's a figure you'll remember. If you take the average square kilometre of the OECD is all the rich countries in the world. The average square kilometre of the rich countries of the world, the value of subsoil assets is around $120,000. If you take now let's move to Africa, and we'll take the average square kilometre of Africa. And we take that same concept, the value of subsoil assets in that average square kilometre of Africa. And remember the earthquakes and the schools that collapsed because they were shoddily built. And ordinary Chinese citizens were able to communicate on the net fast enough to discover why their schools were collapsing, why their children had been killed, and who was responsible, and then to come out in the streets and protest. And there's a wonderful picture of a Chinese local government official on his knees before a crowd of angry parents, begging forgiveness. Now, if that is possible in China, which is one of the most authoritarian societies in the world, building a critical mass of informed opinion in most of the resource-rich countries should now be feasible. That's what my little book, The Plunder Planet, says. You won't be able to read it because it's not coming out till April, but thank you very much.